Welcome to a Modern Japan History Association new book talk. We have the real pleasure today to talk with Kerry Smith, professor of history at Brown University, about his book, Predicting Disasters, Earthquakes, Scientists, and Uncertainty in Modern Japan, which was published this year by University of Pennsylvania Press. In terms of the structure of our time together, I'll give a brief introduction of Kerry and the book. He'll then speak about predicting disasters. I'll offer some questions for discussion, and then we'll open it up to Q&A with all of you. So I became familiar with Kerry's work through his first book, A Time of Crisis, Japan, the Great Depression, and Rural Revitalization, which is a seminal examination of the social, economic, and political reverberations of the Great Depression, particularly on the experiences of rural communities, as well as on conceptions of the countryside in 1930s Japan and beyond. This book continues to be one of the few in English that focuses on pre-war rural life and that foregrounds economic history as part of a broader exploration of the 1930s and its legacies. Kerry's research has taken up other topics since then, including Showa Hall and its public memorialization of the war. But I think a connecting thread in his work, all the way through predicting disasters, is a concern with a complicated disaster or crisis and how it was thought about and understood by various people, and what that in turn says about societal anxieties and desires of the time. In predicting disasters, the disaster of central concern is earthquakes and seismicity. And the book's focus is on how scientists attempted to improve their ability to predict earthquakes and to convince policymakers and the public that such prediction was possible. And driving the scientific and political project of earthquake prediction, that is a project of trying to forecast when and where destructive earthquakes were likely to happen. So driving this project was the aim of reducing uncertainty and risk and minimizing the possibility of a dangerous future, often to protect the nation. The narrative arc of the book starts in the pre-war to establish what turned out to be precursors of ways of thinking about earthquake prediction that would evolve and become more fully formed in the post-war. It was in the 1960s and 1970s that were the kind of apogee of scientific beliefs in earthquake prediction, that is the ability to predict earthquakes, that went on to undergird legislation, policy, and broader public views of impending earthquake disasters. And so much so that faith in the ability to forecast earthquakes, especially of the short-term variety that is predicting earthquakes minutes, hours, or a few days in advance, that faith endured longer in post-war Japan than elsewhere. At the same time, there also came to be increasing tensions between the primary claims of earthquake prediction scientists and others with dissenting views. And there also came to be a kind of increasingly visible disjuncture between forecasts and actual earthquakes. So I can't possibly do justice to the book with this short summary. So let me turn it over now to Kerry to elaborate on the arguments and contributions of predicting disasters.
Thank you, Eiko, for that wonderful introduction and the great summary of the book, and for someone read the first book, which is great. I wasn't sure that that was still out there. And thanks, Nick, as well, and to the Modern Japan History Association for putting this together. And thanks everybody in the audience for coming at what I know is a very busy time of year. Carol's talk last week set a really high bar, but I'm grateful for this opportunity to talk to you a little bit about predicting disasters. So what I thought I'd do is start out with talking about how the book came to be, sort of a little bit about the book's history, and then walk through sort of the three categories of the through lines of the book, one being disasters, the other being scientists, and the last one, prediction and uncertainty. And that should hopefully take us through to some conversation with Eiko as well. So when I finished my last book, the first book, I had it in my head that I was going to do something on the Great Kanto earthquake. And because at the moment, at that point, there really wasn't much in English about the Great Kanto earthquake. And I got started on one piece of it, which was knowledge production by scientists, by the scientific community, because that was an area that there's a lot out there in the Japanese language materials after the earthquake, and not had much had been written about it at that point. So I got started on that, and then I got caught in, or well, no one twisted my arm, but I ended up in administration, being a chair for about 6 years. And while I was doing that, the field essentially changed pretty radically. That Charles Schenking's book came out, Jennifer Weisenfeld's book came out, Janet Borland had a number of articles out, Greg Smits had his two books come out, all about earthquakes, all about seismicity, and this was all after Greg Clancy's book as well, which, I mean, for obvious reasons, made me rethink whether it was the field needed another book on the Great Kanto earthquake at that point, and whether I was still interested in it. But I did have the work that I had started on the scientific knowledge production in 1923. And it had focused particularly on one scientist, Imamura Akitsune, who was had no professional profile, or very little professional profile, up to the earthquake itself. He had been involved in a pretty significant controversy with his mentor that started back in 1905, which had sort of put an end to his career. He was the scientist who was in the Todai University seismicity lab when the earthquake hit. And so he became, in many ways, the public face of science in the aftermath of the earthquake, and went on to have a very prolific writing career after that. So he was one of the first people I focused on. And his claim to fame at that point was that he said that he had forecast the Great Kanto earthquake back in 1905. He had warned the public about it, and had been ignored or criticized by his mentor for disrupting society and for making claims that he couldn't verify. So um, he then said that the events of September 1st, 1923, the earthquake itself, basically validated his argument and his prescience. And he shifted his focus after that to trying to lead the field into a greater interest in earthquake prediction, in long-term and short-term earthquake prediction, and was ignored again for the most part. Um, and the more I got into looking at his career and sort of things he was writing, the people were reacting to him, the larger this bigger problem about prediction and uncertainty loomed. And I resisted going down that road for as long as I could, because I knew it was going to be very difficult. Earthquake prediction seemed such a far out idea that it wasn't one that I thought would actually have a lot of traction. But it turns out it did. And there was a very long thread that ran from Imamura to his students, to their students, really to the present day, that sort of follows this trail of prediction and forecasting in pre-war and then into post-war Japan as well. So in some ways, the Charles's great book and Jennifer's as well were helpful in helping me make that turn and sort of figure out a different direction that I wanted to take it. 311 also pretty radically transformed my thinking about the book, in part because it brought forward a number of debates that had been quiet for quite a while in Japan since 1995 about prediction, about the role of seismologists in science. And at some point, it clicked for me that what was happening, or one of the things that was happening in the scientific community, was that they were having arguments over the same problems with uncertainty, the same problems with prediction and forecasting in 2011 that they had been having in 1923 and 1905, in the 1960s and 1970s. The basic vocabularies and frameworks were pretty much the same. And that meant that in some ways I definitely needed to bring this up to the present day. I couldn't stop in 1995, which was my original plan. So working through since 2011, the implications of what that debate turned out to be, and the follow through, and the ways in which that disaster has transformed thinking about prediction in Japan, led to finally the final shape of this book. Okay, so let me shift to talk a little bit about disasters, and here I'll try and share my screen if I can do that. Hopefully I can find. Of course, now it's not going to work. It was working great before. There we go. Share. Okay. Can you see the cover of my book? Okay, great. All right. So on the theme of disasters is sort of the main one of the through lines in the book. Um, One of the points I was trying to get across or to focus on was that um, the research that we did have, or not, the understanding of the impact of disasters in modern Japan, um, had a number of qualities associated with it. One was that it was tended to be episodic. So we had a pretty good picture of the effects of the Nobe earthquake through Great Clancy, the Great Kanto earthquake in particular. But they and the scholarship on those events was tremendous, but it was focused on sort of that moment and to some extent on its legacies. And part of what I wanted to do in this book was to look at disasters as a longer process, as a process that unfolded throughout the 20th century, looking at the spaces in between major disasters. So although the book does touch on for the Great Kanto earthquake, the Hanshin earthquake in 95, and of course 311, I also spent a fair amount of time looking at some somewhat less well-known, but I argue very formative disasters in the postwar in particular, the 1946 Nankaido earthquake, the Fukui earthquake shortly after that, the Niigata earthquake in 1964. This is just an image from the Nankai earthquake. And what was significant about these for me was that they helped shift the debate about prediction's value or its importance going forward, what work it might do for the nation in ways that really hadn't been brought forward in quite the same way before. The 1964 Niigata earthquake, in particular, I argue, came at a moment when it had been a number of years since there had been a major urban earthquake. And when this struck Niigata City in June of 64, it brought to the public's attention and to the government's attention the fact that Japan's cities were suddenly vulnerable in ways that they hadn't been, perhaps in 1923. And what happened in Niigata with the collapse of modern infrastructure, the bridges, the oil refinery fires, and the like, the collapse of apartment buildings, triggered a debate or discussion about what would happen if a similar earthquake were to take place in Tokyo or in Osaka or some other places, because the landscape was quite similar. The buildings were similar. And it had been quite a long time since this type of discussion had been brought forward in quite that same way. And part of what I point to here is that after 1964 in particular, the debates about what to do in Tokyo surfaced in ways that they hadn't been before. There was a particular scientist associated with this, and I'll talk about him in a second, who argued that in 1964 that he had discovered a pattern, a statistically significant periodization for major earthquakes in the Southern Kanto area that led him to argue that there was roughly a 69-year cycle to major destructive earthquakes in Tokyo. And counting forward from 1923, that meant that sort of the next cycle or the next high risk period would come in the 1970s for Tokyo, and that they should begin preparing for it. And one of the things I do in the book is trace the way in which the city of Tokyo responded to that and the steps that it took to both transform some of the physical landscape, the built landscape of the city, and then the social engineering steps that it took as well. So the actual earthquakes are sort of one type of disaster that I talk about. The book also looks at the history. It is a history of earthquakes that haven't happened yet. And by that, I mean both the one that we were just talking about in Tokyo in 1964 and the aftermath of that. The other major earthquake that hasn't happened yet that the book engages with is the Tokai earthquake, which is surfaces for the public in 1976. It's brought forward by a young, at the time, graduate student at University of Tokyo, and sort of reaches its full public the height of the public's concern over this earthquake comes in 1978, when the government passes a major law that's designed to protect the Tokai region from the next earthquake or from the effects of the next earthquake, primarily by relying on the assumption that scientists are going to be able to predict it, and that they will know days, hours, or minutes ahead of time that it's about to happen. And the law that is passed in 78 consists solely of the steps that would be taken after the prediction was announced. So the broader piece of this is that really since the 1960s, there hasn't been a moment when Tokyo, the Tokai earthquake, the Tokai region, and several other parts of Japan have not been anticipating a major destructive earthquake. And what accompanied those discoveries or those predictions were often fairly elaborate scenarios developed by um, scientists and public policy makers that described in great detail what was going to happen to Tokyo or what would happen to the Tokai district were these earthquakes to hit. And they were quite specific in terms of number of casualties, in terms of the number of deaths they anticipated. So this was also a break with the past in terms of how the public was being asked to engage with the threat and the hazards that they faced going forward. And these were represented in fiction and reflected in fiction and film in the 70s in particular as well. Okay, so that's part of what the disasters are doing in the book. The scientist piece of this begins with Imamura and his post 1923 earthquake career and his shift to being a public proponent of prediction. Imamura, like many of the other scientists I worked with, he was a prolific writer, and not just in scientific journals, but in public venues, Kaizo, Chuokoron, places like that, anywhere that would take him, it seemed. He had something to say about the earthquake and about 1923 in particular. And he was a vehicle for the book in thinking about what were the arguments being made against someone who wanted to pursue prediction? How did the field react to that? And their assertions that it was unscientific, that it was none of what he was doing was real science, really stuck for almost 20 years and isn't challenged significantly again until after the end of World War II. I forgot to preface this by saying that part of what the book argues is that we've sort of missed out on talking about scientists in modern Japanese history, at least in the 20th century. We have some wonderful works about public health and about the medical profession, but scientists as public actors, as social actors, is something that we haven't spent a lot of time looking at. And looking at the earth scientists and their visibility and their public presence was one way I thought to begin to address that. So looking at Imamura, looking at someone who was not trained directly by him, but was one of his people who supported him in his later years, Kawasumi Hiroshi, who is also a scientist trained seismologist trained at University of Tokyo. He's seen here in the aftermath of the Fukui earthquake. Kawasumi Hiroshi was the scientist who came up with this idea of the 69-year cycle for the next major Tokyo earthquake and brought that to the public. After he makes this announcement in 64, he becomes a very visible figure in the media in the late 1960s on until his death in the early 1970s. The final scientist that I focus on is Ishibashi Katsuhiko, who is at the time in 1976, he was a graduate student at University of Tokyo, as I mentioned. It was his use of his discovery through his inquiry into historical documents that led him to argue that the Tokai earthquake, which had actually long been anticipated by scientists at that point, was going to be much worse in terms of the damage that it was going to do than anyone had anticipated. He argued that the fault zone was going to be much closer to land than anyone had anticipated, and the destruction would be immense. So he helps bring this to the public in 1976, and then more so in 78. Also becomes something of a public figure, shows up on TV quite a bit, certainly in the newspapers, and really helps launch this massive legislative response to the threats that's posed by the Tokai earthquake. One of the things I struggled with in looking at the scientists and their predictions was that much of what they said turned out to be incorrect or wrong, in the sense that many of them were putting timelines on the predictions that they were making, and that their estimates, their methodologies are ones that scientists would no longer trust or validate. And I think there's certainly a temptation, and this would have been an easier way to approach writing about them, would have been to acknowledge this or sort of start from the premise that they were wrong, and work backwards from that and sort of take a very critical, if not, um, I don't know, a harsh stance against some of the things that they were saying based on what we now know about how seismicity works. But I chose to do something a little bit different, which was to try and treat what they were saying, to take it at face value, for in the context of the moment in which they were publishing it, and trying to get a sense of why the public might have reacted to it the way that they did, not to assert my own or the current field's understanding of their science, but rather to assess it on the terms that it was being treated, at that point. I'm not sure that everyone's satisfied with that. I'm sure that there are some who, still believe that these scientists should have been critiqued at the time and just weren't because of the field's politeness to each other. But that's not the approach that I chose to take. So the prediction piece of this is one that scientists have been working on for a very long time in Japan, from almost from the start of the field itself. The prediction as a way of protecting the country from future destructive earthquakes have been part of the discourse among scientists. But what I show in the book is it doesn't become sort of a serious institutionalized scientific endeavor until after the war, and really not until the 1960s, when the scientists organize around a plan to begin sort of a research program with national funding into short-term earthquake prediction, by which they mean using survey data, using real-time data from places that are suspected to be active seismically. The goal being to maybe find at some point the method that will allow them to provide a warning to the public that an earthquake is about to happen, or it's days or weeks or possibly even months out from the present. And this is a struggle that they began in the 1960s. It starts out as a research program, and quickly evolves into something that's more like a practical program. Some of this has to do with funding and the language that you need to use to get funding from the government at this point. The argument being that if you take the research out of the title of what they were doing, that they're much more likely to get funding than if you were to say something like a program for earthquake prediction, which is what they end up doing in the late 60s. So that program, once it's in place in the 60s, is basically continued to shape the government's approach to short-term earthquake prediction ever since. There are several moments when it looked like that the short-term earthquake prediction program might collapse. After the Hanshin earthquake in 1995 was one of those, but it didn't, and it hasn't. It's still part of the scientific discourse in Japan in ways that it isn't in most other countries, including those that had at one point embraced a short-term earthquake prediction. It's worth pointing out that when they're doing this, sort of when this takes off in the 1960s and 1970s, it's a moment when the entire scientific community globally is interested in this. Plate tectonics theory has come in. It's helping explain a lot of things that were not clear to scientists before. And the more they learn, the more likely it seems that they'll be able to apply the theory to better understand when earthquakes happen, and why they might take place when they do. So there's a lot of excitement about this. Seismologists are looking to meteorology as a model for their own predictive capabilities. And sort of the onset of Cold War futurology and future studies and the like really helps, I think, promote both within the public and then within the scientific community the idea of the possibilities going forward. That prediction is just around the corner. It's something that could certainly be achieved within a short period of time. The predictions and the book talks about fall into these two categories. One is the forecasting, including the sort of thing that Kawasumi Hiroshi is arguing. He had looked at records going back to the 9th century in the southern Kanto district and laid out the years in which these earthquakes occurred, and then studied the intervals between them. And he comes up with a model that if you sort of add 69 years, starting in 1818, you end up with a series that looks like this. And it comes pretty close in some years to mapping onto earthquakes that actually happen, major earthquakes that actually happen. And this is something that he seems to have discovered inadvertently, but he brings this to the public in 1964. The public is fascinated, and to some extent, the government has to respond going forward. His point was that working forward from 1923, that Tokyo was likely to enter another field of higher risk in the mid 1970s. So therefore, they still had 10 years or so to prepare. And he had a number of ideas about what the government might do to help bring that about. Ishibashi Katsuhiko's forecasting model for the Tokai earthquake followed something of a similar pattern, looking at the periods between the intervals between major earthquakes along the Nankai Trough. And the indication, the conclusion scientists had come to at that point was that zone D along the Tokai district was due for an earthquake, that if not overdue. And this was sort of also accepted as a very useful way of thinking about what the risks were going forward. The government has, by and large, not given up, or at least not stopped funding the pursuit of short-term earthquake prediction. Those sensors are still in place. There's still a fair amount of research going on around it. But since 1995, it's also added to that a layer of probabilistic hazard mapping. And you've probably all seen versions of this map of the National Seismic Hazard Map, which shows sort of color-coded indications of places of higher and lower risk. And these have been published since the early 21st century, and sort of the state of the art at the moment for the ways in which the government explains risk and uncertainty to the public. These aren't based on well, let me put it this way. The data that goes into these and the models that are used to project these hazards suffer from some of the same problems that the forecasting models suffer from, which is that the data doesn't go back that far. There's a lot of assumptions being made about periodicity and this amount of stress that builds up along fault zones and the like. So they're helpful. They're very easy to understand. They show that the government's doing something, but they aren't necessarily particularly reliable as tools for thinking about risk or thinking about hazard. And the last thing I'll close out with this is that, and I got this, thank you, Jordan Sand, for sending this to me. He said he found it at Yodobashi Camera recently. But I hadn't seen this particular version before, but it's a representative, I think, of sort of the state of the discourse at the moment and expectations at the moment about the ability to forecast earthquakes. I mean, the promise that they would 530 yen a month, that you would get warnings a month in advance that an earthquake might be likely, is certainly something that the earth scientists do not embrace by any means. But it has become so commonplace to think that this might be possible, that just the amount of data and the amount of investment that's gone into collecting that data about earthquake and seismicity in Japan is increasingly being monetized, I think, in ways that the examples of which we see here. So let me stop there and can turn to a conversation, hopefully, and answer some questions down the road as well. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. That captures really nicely the kind of main threads of the book and the kind of what happens and the kind of arguments that are made as they are woven together. I thought maybe I'd pick up on the last thread, the one about prediction. Maybe start there. And I should say I have maybe three main questions or sets of questions, and I'll kind of sequence them from the more informational or empirical to the more historiographical or conceptual. Right. So kind of picking up on the thread the thread about prediction, which is really a question about how you really so nicely in the book fill out quite fully the socio-political context for earthquake prediction in modern Japan. And I'm curious about other parts of this context for these conversations that are happening about earthquake prediction. So on the prediction part. So first, I'm curious about other examples of prediction, particularly of the sort that has been tied to risk mitigation.
Mhm.
which you do touch on in the introduction, especially as they relate to the post-war. But one of the cases that comes to mind is the life insurance industry.
Yeah,
Thinking of Ryan Moran's book Selling the Future, about the kind of early history of the of Japanese life insurance, which developed in early Meiji at the same time as the kind of discipline of seismology,
right,
with the aim of convincing people that the future could be predicted, and that the life insurance industry could provide some sort of security, in a time of crisis against a dangerous future.
right.
So that, I mean, that's one example that comes to mind. Another one is financial predictions,
Mhm.
particularly forecasting the behavior of financial markets. And here, I wonder if there might be some parallel to developments in the post-war, when there's kind of increasingly sophisticated theories and methods for speculative trading on financial markets.
Mhm.
I'm thinking of someone like the American economist Harry Markowitz and his ideas about in the 1950s about what became American portfolio theory. Also the expansion of futures markets in the 1970s.
Wow.
Even so, while futures markets actually date back, to the Tokugawa period, with rice, there's an expansion in the early 1970s, in terms of financial contracts or futures contracts for agricultural commodities, not just financial products. Anyway, so that's
Mhm.
a kind of similar moment in time. So that's the first part of the question about whether there's something, in terms of the context of other prediction in other areas, that has parallels to or informs the science of earthquake prediction. And then the second part of this question is, which might be related to the first, is whether there were developments in mathematics or statistics, and technology that shaped the history of earthquake prediction. For example, were there developments in methods of calculating probability, or the evolution of computing comes to mind, especially for
Right.
the 60s and 70s, the ability to analyze larger bodies of data that had any kind of impact on the science of earthquake prediction. I think what I'm really asking about is what parallels or connections were there to practices of prediction in other realms, which might echo your arguments about conceptions of dangerous futures?
Right.
And where might seismology have been more distinctive, which might reveal something about kind of particular concerns related to earthquakes?
Great. Wow, those are great questions. And I bumped up fairly often against earthquake insurance and fire insurance as consumers of the data that seismologists were putting out, sort of using those hazard maps as a way to set rates for different parts of the country and different parts of Tokyo in particular. I don't see a lot of, I don't see the scientists themselves, at least the generations I was working with, as adopting the same sort of the models and the techniques that you might see in financial markets for um, probabilistic calculations or for thinking about scenarios, for modeling in the future. A lot of what I saw and came across, at least the public facing piece of it, tended to be pretty straightforward. I mean, the calculations that Kawasumi Hiroshi were doing was just subtraction. I mean, that was not in the background. He was doing other things. He was making using some fairly sophisticated analysis, not requiring computers, to try and weed out the noise in his data. And he shows some of his work, but not all of it. He said he came to the conclusion that it wasn't noise. It was actually seeing something that was statistically significant. So that was information that he shared with colleagues, but not necessarily with the public. And I think some of the tension there is that there was a Kawasumi and others think had a hard time explaining why this data was significant, sort of what it meant that there was a 69-year cycle. What's the importance of this? What does it mean for you? And I think the desire not to make it more complicated than it needed to be was something that worked well for them. Um, I, this shift to futures markets, to thinking about life insurance in particular, and other types of commercial insurance, is one that we know is going on globally, right? Certainly in the United States, in the teens and 20s, if not earlier. And I touch on that a little bit in the book, but I think your question about where's the overlap or sort of are they feeding into each other is one that I don't address sufficiently. Um, the probabilistic hazard mapping piece of this that begins in the 1990s does rely on very sophisticated modeling techniques and calculations. Um, and I think that's part of the appeal to it is that it feels rigorous, and it feels like it maps onto or is equivalent to the types of calculations we know go on in markets today, and in other fields. It's not clear the data going in is not as clean as it would need to be, and it's not even certain that the calculations they're doing are actually calculating risk in a useful way. But they're similar to that, and they feel the same way in the sense that there's a lot of calculations, there's a lot of formulas that are made shared with the public. It seems very sophisticated and complex in much the same way that the models you were talking about, I think, also seem to the public. They might not understand them because they are so complicated, but they seem to produce results that are legible and ones that can be acted upon.
Interesting. So in some ways, would you say that what was the kind of relative simplicity of Kawasumi's 69-year cycle argument in the 60s helped to make it convincing in the same way that the kind of rigor and sophistication of the hazard maps decades later, it was actually their rigor and sophistication that helped them kind of resonate more broadly?
And I think that the maps themselves are really cool, and you can sort of
Yeah.
get down to a, a block level analysis of risk for particular parts of Japan, and they sort of break it out for 30-year intervals at sort of different categories. So they feel trustworthy in the sense that they're put out by the government. They sort of put out in a regular cycle. They seem to rely on science, but I don't know that the average person, I certainly couldn't sit down with the materials and the data and say, well, this actually, this makes sense. The critics of this, Bob Geller and others, have pointed out that yes, they looks good, but there's no reason to believe that what they're calculating is actually predicting anything or based on useful data. We don't have enough data, and even if we did, we probably wouldn't be able to predict accurately what's going on. And you can certainly point to the places on the map that have historically have been indicated to have very low risk, and point to the number of earthquakes that have struck in those areas since these maps came out as another sort of challenge to some of the assumptions that seem to underlie them.
Yeah. So the mention of the critics, and maybe gets to a question about knowability. So maybe this is kind of somewhat related to the second question. So this is a little ill-defined or abstract. So please feel free to take this in whatever direction might be most interesting. But I'm curious about the relationship between conceptions of time or kind of different time scales and knowability or beliefs about what is and isn't knowable. And curious about this relationship in the understandings of well, actually three groups: the earthquake scientists, the
Mhm.
Japanese public, and you as the historian.
Right.
So with the earthquake scientists, Kawasumi at one point spoke about how earthquakes are phenomenon that occur over a very long time span.
Right.
And yet there was growing faith in the 60s and 70s about the ability to improve kind of short-term earthquake prediction. And I was wondering how a scientist like Kawasumi and others reconciled the tension between kind of geologic time and the time scale of their practice of prediction. So that's the earthquake scientists, or at least maybe Kawasumi in particular. For the Japanese public, particularly starting in the 60s, but perhaps also even going back to the 20s, I wonder about the extent to which earthquakes were perceived were not perceived as a particular moment in long geologic time, but as a sudden and unexpected rupture in time. And I wonder if that actually bolsters your argument about kind of in some ways how remarkable it was, a kind of enduring public belief in earthquake prediction, given the experiences and the kind of rupture of actual earthquakes. And then for you as a historian, you make the argument that disasters as a category of analysis, or at least a phenomenon, should take their place along with economic ups and downs and the rise of the middle class and wartime legacies as a way of understanding post-war Japan. And do you think that there is something about the temporality of earthquake disasters that disrupts or raises new questions about our understandings of post-war Japanese history? So I'm thinking about, the way in which earthquakes could be viewed as for pushing against, for example, kind of Brodelian notions of the geologic as exemplifying the
Mhm.
longue durée.
Right.
But so is there something about earthquake disasters, feared and actual, that could have upset chronological understandings of the post-war?
Those are all really great questions. Let me take them in reverse and from three back to one. Um, well, I mean, it would be, I wish I could say for sure that that yes was the answer, that it does sort of not fall into any of the chronologies we've imposed on modern Japan. One of the problems with that is that there is this pretty sharp break that happens right after 1945 that is sort of contingent on the American occupation and sort of the circumstances of the war. So it in some ways fits into that. Um, uh, but at the same time, these are one of the reasons I think that these hazard maps, for example, use 30-year intervals is because that's sort of the temporal frontier for a lot of people, right? Is that you can't sort of 40 years, 50 years is too far in the future. 30 years seems like something you might worry about and could actually, but there's enough time to do something about it too, right? If you have a 5-year window or a 10-year window, you might not be able to fix things. But 30 years, maybe it's just enough time to make some preparations for it. I don't know that that's actually been measured, but that's sort of one indication of how this the problem of temporality works. Um, Japanese seismologists also, and one of the reasons I think the field took off the way that it did in Japan, have a much better written record than a lot of places, right? So the very precise dating all the way back to, this is even before you do the paleoseismic work, dating back to the 9th century, the 8th century. So dates and times and places, which is some of the work that scientists were doing in the 40s and 50s was sort of assigning magnitudes to those earthquakes. So that sense that Japan has better data because it can go back that long gives a sense that we know much more. We have a much longer time frame to work with than anybody else. And so on that scale, there seems to be more information that you can presumably use to do prediction or a forecast. And Japan's therefore better able to do this and more situated to do it than anybody else. But once you actually step back from that sort of very, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, and begin to look at, geologic time, that completely breaks down. It's totally irrelevant and doesn't really help us understand the likelihood of a particular event going forward. But I think from the public's perspective, these much shorter intervals of 30 years, 50 years, 10 years or something are the ones that do seem actionable. And the other thing I'll say about this is that because of plate tectonics, because of the emergence of new sensing technologies and the development of these sensing networks in Japan, sort of the global expansion of the field as well. I think both the field's relationship to temporality and the public's relationship to temporality shift in the 60s and 70s. In some ways, maybe it doesn't matter as much that this this very long history, much of it is invisible to us because our understanding of what's going on underneath the surface of the earth is so much better now that we can, therefore, the short-term prediction, the pursuit of that doesn't depend on us understanding something that happened 20,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. It's immediate. It's something that's unfolding right beneath our feet right now. And if we can figure that out, sort of the temporality problem is done with. We might need the forecasting to know where to look, right, to figure out where to put these sensors and everything. But if you can figure that short-term piece out, the long-term isn't nearly as problematic as it was before.
Yeah, that's interesting. So if we pick up on the kind of shifts that happen in the 60s and the 70s, maybe I'll transition into my kind of last set of questions. So I'd love to hear more about one of the book's central contentions, I think, which is that its topic, as you say in the introduction, helps us better understand how the past has influenced beliefs about Japan's possible futures.
Right.
So first, picking up on the 1960s and 70s, and what is admittedly a very self-interested question because I'm especially interested in the 1970s at the moment.
Mhm.
But you demonstrate really convincingly that the 1960s and 70s were a kind of pivotal moment in the post-war, the kind of post-war history of earthquake prediction science, when there came to be a more kind of widespread acceptance by the government and among the public that there would be catastrophic earthquake disasters in the future. And as a result, there was a kind of shift in conceptions of the future, such that, as you say, it became a kind of new normal, this constant anticipation of a dangerous future. Um, and so I'm wondering, why do you think were the 1960s and 1970s such an inflection point? And in part, you're saying that because, plate tectonics, and so there are things
Yeah,
within the
yeah.
kind of geosciences that explain that. But how would you situate earthquake prediction alongside or together with other developments in these decades to help explain this kind of change in conceptions of the future? The obvious thing to bring up here is Nihon Jinbutsu, or Japan
Yeah,
Sinks.
yeah.
Komatsu Sakyo's novel of 1973, and then also film, manga, television drama, in which, like, literally, due to a catastrophic earthquake, the nation ceases to exist as an idea or an entity
Mhm.
that is connected to land and territory and geography. So
Right,
it's quite literally about an earthquake, but but arguably speaking to anxieties about the future, reflecting broader concerns of the late 60s and 70s. So it's the kind of question about what's going on in 60s and 70s.
yeah.
And then second, relatedly, I was I was wondering if you could elaborate on conceptions of the future, both before the 1960s and 70s, and also what the kind of legacies of the shift in the 60s and 70s, kind of what shifted, what endured in imaginations about the future through the inflection point of the 60s and 70s. I'm maybe especially curious about the 1980s.
Mhm.
And so this is also asking a little bit about the entanglements of earthquake prediction with economic growth, urbanization, other post-war
Right,
developments. So
right,
any kind of narrative arc of conceptions about the future in the
right.
post.
Oh, great questions. Thank you. Um, I mean, we all, and your work has certainly touched on this in the 60s and 70s about waste and sort of thinking about the potential hazards associated with that and the costs associated with that. Um, I mentioned briefly in the book sort of the onset of concerns about pollution in the 70s and the ways in which that reaches the public at more or less the same time, also exactly the same time that Kawasumi is making his predictions in 1964. So um, this there's a tension, I think, that is emerges after 1964 between the growing recognition of rising prosperity, right? Japan is no longer that the middle class is growing. There's all sorts of quality of life seems to be improving. Cities are growing, highways, all the things we associate with the high-speed economic growth. And yet, we there's clearly these vulnerabilities, these problems that are accompanying this growth that hadn't been foreseen and that seem to be sort of deeply built into the system. And pollution is one of them. And the hazards to cities or the threats to cities from seismicity is another one. That those aren't going away anytime soon. But something needs to be done to inoculate the city or inoculate the public into those against those. those potential threats. Um, and one of the sociologists who has looked at this in American context, mostly about sort of nuclear reactors and oil spills and the like, has come up with this phrase of fantasy documents as to describe the ways in which governments and civil organizations provide um, believable responses to these problems as a way of diminishing anxiety about the future and also sort of holding on to expressing confidence in their own abilities, claiming expertise in conversation with every new threat that emerges gets sort of a new set of responses that may or may not work, probably don't, but they are believable in a way that makes it possible to keep going on living. I guess they're sort of not confronting these problems directly. And that certainly is part of what I think happens with the seismicity in the 60s and 70s is both the manufacturing of some steps within Tokyo and elsewhere in response to the Tokai earthquake that reassure the public that steps are being taken. Whether it's this new anti-disaster complex that's built in Koto Ward or the promises that the Tokai earthquake are going to be predicted um, is uh, uh, is part of that. Um, and yeah, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. I was heading somewhere with that. But in addition to the sort of these reassurances coming from the public, um, and you mentioned Japan sinks, but the whole boom, and there's a whole series of sort of semi-documentary works put out in the late 60s about here's what will happen when Tokyo gets hit by the next earthquake, sort of very graphic descriptions of what that would be like, along with the films and sort of whole series of disaster films. And I think there's an argument to be made, Sontag makes this, I think, too, about sort of being confronted with these disasters is also a way of being inoculated against them, right? They become familiar, right? They become so fantastic and so much of a spectacle that the day-to-day threats associated with them become less pressing. And whether we see this with movies and books about nuclear warfare, but I think the same thing applies to seismicity and to the types of threats that Japanese cities were facing in the 60s and in the 60s and the 1970s. And that, I mean, I have a student writing a paper this semester about trying to figure out why is Nihon Chimbutsu so popular? Sort of why has it been remade so many times in so many different mediums? And she's trying to look at what changes over time. But there is something about that idea of total vulnerability, right? That Japan would face something that no one else faces and that it has to come up with a solution to this, or, as in the first film, actually just cease to exist and deal with the legacies of that. So that I think popular media plays a role in this, certainly, in trying to build responses in or offer some solutions or some um, antidotes to the threat that is coming still with us. So I don't know if the latest Netflix, I think, has one of the
Yeah,
more recent Non Shinbutsu series, but that was
2020,
2020. Yeah, so very recent.
2020, which is also kind of interesting in terms of its time.
Yeah, yeah. Um, you asked about the 80s, and the 80s are kind of a blank space in the
Yeah.
book in terms of uh, there isn't there aren't any major earthquakes. The preparations are underway, and I guess the point I would make there is that the passage of the Earthquake Countermeasures Act in 1978 sort of resolves, for some anyway, the growing threat of the Tokai earthquake. It seems to have dealt with that. There are now policies in place, and there aren't any other sort of major threats that are on the horizon, seismically anyway, in the 1980s, once the Tokai earthquake has been dealt with.
Mhm.
What's happened in recent years is that the, the threat of the Tokai earthquake has been downplayed or diminished. And in its place, we now have the threat of the Nankai earthquake, which is sort of all of those segments separating or zipping apart at once, which would be even more catastrophic. And sort of the efforts to deal with that and to persuade the public that the government has some countermeasures in place or can do something about it builds, I think, very much on the models and the practices that we saw in the 60s and 70s. They haven't attempted to, the scientists and the committees are involved in this, haven't attempted to say that they can predict the Nankai earthquake in the short term. But they haven't ruled it out entirely either. So I think last couple of weeks there was actually a warning issued about sort of on the basis of some of the new legislation that was put in place to help prepare for this, to warn people that the likelihood had gone up of a Nankai earthquake. And nothing
Hmm.
happens, but that's sort of the infrastructure that's been put in place that wouldn't be there hadn't in the absence of the steps that were taken to deal with the Tokai earthquake in the 70s.
In the kind of fears of seismicity and the kind of threat of earthquake disasters in the 1970s, was
Yeah,
there any critique of prosperity or urbanism in the sense? Because I was wondering about the parallel that you kind of drew also with pollution. And at least in the 1970s, there was, there were those who said, well, pollution, they talked about pollution as a kind of critique of high-speed
yeah,
economic growth
right.
and tourism and so on. Was there an element of that in the kind of concerns about seismicity, or was it really of a kind of desire to protect the city and the urban and kind of the certain notion of progress?
Right. You could easily see how it could be used as a critique because the the data that they're collecting about the number of fuel trucks that pass through Tokyo every week or every day, the number of the miles of expressways, the kilometers of expressways that have been built, the number of high rises, the number of people who are transiting subways every day. I mean, one argument you can make looking at that is, oh my God, look what's happened to Tokyo. This is how many different gas stations have been built, and where is all this fuel going? And the city doesn't look anything like it did before, and it's awful. But I think your point about protecting is the key one. Is that this is we don't want to lose this, right? Where no one's saying that we need to scale back or move, you know, not allow fuel trucks into the city or not build gas stations and not build highways. It's about, well, how do we live with this and sort of make this make it resilient, although they're not using that language yet. But no one's suggesting that we should go backwards. It's more about how do we keep what we have and not be too anxious about it in the knowledge that actually this threat exists, or we believe that it exists.